Hey folks, this is JR with DIY Prepper. Welcome to the channel. One of my big goals as a prepper is to eventually go off grid. Now, there is a lot that you can do as a prepper just living in a regular house or an apartment, but if you're able to go off grid, then you really can take your preps to a whole other level. And don't get me wrong, I know that this isn't going to be cheap. This is something that most people, myself included, are going to have to work towards over a period of years. But I do think that eventually reaching the point where you can live off grid is a good goal to have, especially if you're somebody who's serious about preparedness or just self-sufficiency. And one of the most important things that you need to truly go off grid is a piece of property large enough to support you and your family, and with that, there's a lot of things to consider. First, you want to avoid any land with conditions that can make it either inaccessible or dangerous. Where I live, flooding is a big one to watch out for since there's a lot of small creeks running through our area. Then of course there's other things like easements or zoning issues, so you want to have a good realtor and land surveyor that can help point those things out. And ideally, when you hire those folks, you want to have somebody who has experience working with homesteaders or at the very least small farmers. One thing that your homestead absolutely must have though is an adequate water supply. You'll want some sort of well as your regular water supply along with a way to access it manually. Then other water sources like ponds are good to have as well for backups. When it comes to how much property you need, think of what you can afford, how much you and your family can manage, and then what exactly you want to do with it. Small homesteads of around 10 acres may be large enough to grow a substantial garden and raise small animals. I personally would eventually like to buy a larger wooded piece of property and then clear out the specific areas that I want to use. That would give me a buffer between myself and my neighbors, and I'd only really need to maintain the cleared out portions. The wooded areas could mostly be left alone and used for hunting, and the trees themselves could be used as fuel or building materials. Then you also want your home on that property to meet a few different criteria, and the first one that comes to mind is storage, because it's always such a big challenge for preppers. If you're somebody who's going to be building, then you can incorporate that during the planning phases by designing your house with things like large walk-in pantries or closets with built-in shelving. Another thing you want to incorporate into your home is a rainwater harvesting system. This can be used to water your garden during normal times or as a backup water supply if something happens to your well. You should also have a good quality water filter in case you need to use secondary water sources, along with a way to boil large quantities of water in case something happens to that filter. But if you do get serious about building an off-grid home, I strongly recommend picking up a copy of The Secure Home. It does a really good job giving detailed information about the different features that you may want to incorporate into your home. But one big consideration for an off-grid home is energy. Depending on your needs and budget, you could have a system that's completely independent, or you could have one that relies on grid power most of the time, but also has a pretty substantial backup. And as a backup, traditional fuel-based options can work well during normal times. These can include regular portable generators or standby generators that have been permanently tied into your home's electrical and gas utilities. However, their biggest drawback is they'll only be useful for as long as you have fuel. Once that runs out, they're basically huge paperweights. Another issue with them is that since they have so many moving parts, they may need to be repaired eventually, but at the very least, you're going to need to do maintenance on them in the form of things like oil changes and new spark plugs. So to be truly off-grid, preppers should take advantage of renewable energy sources like solar and wind power. While wind power is becoming more common, it's still hard to find affordable whole home or even portable options. So for most preppers, solar's probably going to be the way to go, especially if you're wanting a larger whole home system. And if that system has a large enough array of solar panels, you may even be able to sell excess energy to your utility company, but that of course would require a grid tie-in. For my backup solar power, I've been using EcoFlow's portable solar generators for a couple of years now. I've had the chance to look at several of their products, and the reason why I continue to use them and show them on my channel is that they work. Everything that I've tested does exactly what it's supposed to do, it's reliable, and in some cases has outperformed its specifications. Recently, EcoFlow invited me to their booth at the Consumer Electronics Show to see the different solar power options that they offer, so I'd like to thank them for doing that and for sponsoring this video. While I was there, I got to see the unveiling of the new Delta Pro Ultra, which unlike their other products was designed from the very beginning to be a whole home power solution. I did a video on it towards the beginning of January, and what I like about it is that it's extremely powerful and it's fully expandable. It can handle up to 7,200 running watts, which is enough power to run anything in your home, including larger appliances like clothes dryers and electric ovens. At one point, I was running our furnace fan, dishwasher, refrigerator, and box freezer and never got close to maxing it out. In its most basic form, it has a capacity of 6 kilowatt hours, but you can add batteries and inverters to the system to give you up to 90 kilowatt hours of energy. This would be a great option if you're wanting an off-grid system because you can customize it to fit your home's energy needs, and it can also handle solar input up to 5,600 watts. That means that it can handle everything from small portable panels all the way to larger roof-mounted solar panel arrays. I also got to see their smart generator, which can be used with larger power options like the Delta Pro Ultra or original Delta Pro to provide supplemental power during times where you're not receiving much sunlight due to storms or heavy cloud cover. Then they also had several of their portable power options. While these won't run your entire house, they can give you off-grid capability on a smaller scale. The Delta 2 Max is one of my favorite solar generators since it has a powerful enough inverter to run pretty much anything that uses a regular 120 volt plug. I recently used ours during an overnight power outage to run our fridge and box freezer. It lasted all night, had plenty of power left over, and most importantly, it saved me from having to wheel out my gas generator at around midnight. You can also use something like the Delta 2 Max to run power tools if you need to do an off-grid building project. I used the original Delta Max to build a container garden stand at our old dearlies. It ran my table saw, sliding miter saw, and circular saw without any problems. And while most of us would like to keep our larger appliances running for an extended period of time, many times the smaller devices can be just as important. If we were in a real bad situation where we lost things like the internet and cellular service, being able to use things like ham radios, GMRS radios, and even flashlights could be a game changer. And EcoFlow's River lineup does an excellent job filling these needs. The smallest one, the River 2, works really well for those small devices and for powering other things like lights. Like right now, my River 2 is being used to power that blue light off to the side. It's actually just a regular floor lamp with a blue LED light bulb in it. The River 2 Pro is another good option since it's relatively small but can power many of the same devices as larger power stations like the Delta 2 Max, like my box freezer and my power tools. So if you're looking for a backup power option, especially one that's solar based, I strongly recommend checking out EcoFlow. And if you do that and you decide you want to order something, if you use this code and the links in the description below, you can get an extra 5% off. Another thing that you'll need to go off-grid is the ability to grow or raise your own food. Gardening is probably the first thing that comes to most people's minds, and what's nice about it is that you can start to do that even before you get land. Container gardening, for example, can even be done in an apartment if you have a porch or balcony, and raised beds work well if you're someone like me who has a small yard. When it comes to supplies, the first thing you should get is a good supply of heirloom seeds. Heirloom seeds, of course, are preferable because they produce plants that grow true to type, meaning that you can use the seeds from this year's harvest to plant next year's garden. And if you have land or even a small yard, planting fruit trees can be a good way to have a food supply that'll grow back year after year. But if you start to get serious about growing a large garden on your property, you may want to check out permaculture. With that, you're basically just gardening in such a way that individual plants complement each other and more or less form their own little ecosystem. Nitrogen-fixing plants like soybeans can prevent the nitrogen in your soil from becoming depleted, while flowers like lavender attract pollinating insects to your garden. The Secret Garden of Survival is a good resource that can give you an idea of how to cultivate a food forest that, once established, will grow back year after year and will blend in with the naturally occurring vegetation around it. Then, other than seeds and plants, you'll also need other items. Garden hoses are an absolute must, along with shovels of different sizes, rakes, and other tools. Also be sure to have ways to support plants like tomato cages or trellises, because very few things are more frustrating than spending 2 months getting a plant to the point where it's producing fruit, and then a thunderstorm comes, blows it over, and it snaps in half, and all that work is just down the toilet. If you plan on raising animals, be sure to have everything that you need to take care of them. Have ways to keep them contained so that they don't wander off, and also keep them protected from wild animals like coyotes. Also have a plan for how you're going to take care of your animals if you can't just run to the feed store and get them more food, and how you go about doing that's largely going to depend on the animals that you have. Omnivores like chickens and pigs are nice since they can eat either plants or meat, and that can include table scraps or the less desirable parts of any animals that you harvest. Beekeeping is another option, but like other things will require specialized equipment to do properly. Then of course hunting and fishing can be options as well, but just remember if it's a really widespread situation, then a lot of game animals may be hunted to the point of extinction, so you probably want to focus a lot of your energy on being able to produce your own food. Then another area that you need to address if you're going off-grid is medicine and first aid. Because even during normal times, if you're living off-grid, there's a very good chance that the nearest medical facility is probably going to be a fair distance away. So you do need to be able to deal with any injuries, kind of stabilize them so that you can get to help or you can render aid while help is on the way. But during a disaster, you and your family may be the only help that's coming, so having things like gauze pads, rolled gauze, and tourniquets can give you a better chance of being able to deal with larger injuries. Also take advantage of training opportunities that are available now so you'll know how to deal with those. But it's also important to remember that even small wounds can cause big problems if they get infected, so you want to have a good collection of small bandages and antiseptics as well. When it comes to medications, antibiotics are essential for treating certain illnesses or injuries that get infected. Although other sources of these aren't available anymore, you can still get a legally prescribed emergency supply from companies like Jace Medical. Also, don't overlook common over-the-counter medications. While pain relievers and fever reducers are what people tend to think of first, stomach medications may be more important during a long-term grid-down situation because of dietary changes and a greater reliance on natural food and water sources. Pepto, for example, can even inhibit the growth of microorganisms in your digestive tract, which is good if you get some sort of stomach bug, but just remember it should not be given to people 16 and under because of its similarities to aspirin. Then it's also a good idea to have a way to isolate sick members of your family or group to prevent illnesses from spreading. Having things like plastic sheeting and painter's tape can help you set up quarantine zones, and having gloves and respirators can help protect those caring for the ill. The next thing that preppers need to consider if they want to go off-grid is hygiene, and that goes beyond just bathing frequently enough that you don't start to smell like a moose or grow barnacles. And probably the most critical hygiene task will be how you dispose of waste. Most rural homes will have a septic tank, and how long that'll last will depend on the last time it was pumped, the capacity of your tank, and how often it's utilized. But if a situation lasts long enough, you're going to need to figure out another way to deal with that. Outhouses and latrines have been used for ages for this purpose, and when building one, you want to keep a few things in mind. First, you want it to be far enough away from your home and deep enough that smells don't waft places that you don't want them. And there's a lot of information out there that kind of says a lot of different things, but a good guideline might be around 50 feet away from your home at around 4 feet deep. You also want any latrine to be at least 30 to 50 meters away from any water sources and no deeper than 2 meters above the water table to prevent contamination. Then you'll also need to consider how you're going to deal with other kinds of waste. Food scraps are easy if you're raising animals, since you can just use leftovers to feed them or throw them in a compost bin. Paper products can be composted as well, as long as they're not glossy or colored or contaminated with human waste or chemicals. Other things can either be buried or burned, although burying it will probably be safer from a health standpoint. Burning certain things like plastics can release harmful substances into the air and can create smoke or flames that could be seen from long distances. And when burying household waste, you want to follow many of the same rules that you would with building a latrine, like you want it to be far enough away from your house, you want it to be far enough away from water sources, and you also don't want to bury anything deeper than the water table level. Then beyond waste, there's also laundry to consider. At a bare minimum, I'd recommend having a washboard, basin, and plenty of cordage that you could use as a clothesline along with plenty of soap. You could also get extra things like a clothes wringer or a manual washing machine to make the job a little easier. Another thing that you'll need if you want to go off-grid is the ability to communicate. For short-range communications between members of your group, FRS and GMRS radios are good options. FRS radios are basically just common two-way walkie-talkies. You can find them at pretty much any big box or sporting goods store, and good things about them are that they're easy to use, they're relatively cheap, and they don't require any sort of special licensing or training to operate. Then GMRS radios are the next step up in power. You can get them as handheld radios like regular walkie-talkies, or you can get more powerful mobile versions to keep in vehicles. These do require a license to operate while society is up and running, and I repeat, while society is up and running. It seems like anytime I mention licensing, people somehow don't hear me say that. But anyway, they're nice since they give you a little bit more power, so if you're needing to communicate over a larger piece of property, you can do that, or you could also use them to communicate with neighbors a little bit further away. Then ham and shortwave radios are good for longer range communication. Ham radios really are just limited by the setup that you have, so if you have something like a base station in your home with a reliable way to produce sufficient power, you really could communicate over longer distances, and that of course would increase if repeaters are still somehow up and running. But if you're just interested in listening, then picking up a good shortwave radio will allow you to pick up communications from ham operators and international broadcasts. And y'all, the topic of going off-grid really is too big to just be covered in one video. So if there's anything that you'd like to see me cover or cover in greater detail, then be sure to leave that in the comments below. And I know that one big one that I didn't cover today was security, so if you want to learn more about how to secure your home, whether it's where you're living now or like a larger piece of property, then be sure to check out this video. Or if you want to see 10 areas of preparedness that everybody should have covered, then click here. Once again, I'd like to thank EcoFlow for sponsoring us today. Thank y'all for stopping by. Y'all have a good one.